James Sullivan has spent years navigating the sharp-tongued battles of Washington, D.C., where every word was a calculated move in a game of politics. But when he retired from public office, at least in an official sense, he longed for something simpler: a quiet home, a garden where he could feel the earth in his hands again, a neighborhood where people exchanged pleasantries over the fence instead of shouting over congressional hearings. Oak Estates, with its manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks, promised exactly that: a peaceful, gated community tucked away from the chaos of the world. It had been advertised as a haven, a place where community values were paramount. James had spent his career fighting for fairness in housing policies, so the irony of moving into an HOA-controlled suburb wasn't lost on him. But what truly mattered was Max. Max wasn't just a dog. He was James' anchor, a golden retriever with a temperament as steady as a seasoned diplomat. When the nightmares came, memories of desert nights and gunfire echoing in his skull, it was Max who brought him back, pressing his warm body against James' leg, reminding him that he was home, that he was safe. The moment James stepped onto his new front lawn, Max at his side, he felt a sense of relief he hadn't known in years. Finally, a place where he could breathe. He had no idea that within weeks, that breath would turn into a battle cry. The trouble began with a piece of paper. A pink slip aggressively taped his front door, the adhesive so strong it nearly peeled off the paint when James removed it. The message was hastily scrawled in thick, black marker, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who wrote with more rage than care. Unauthorized pet violation of HOA codes. Immediate compliance required. James let out a chuckle, shaking his head as he reread the words. Clearly, they hadn't done their homework. Federal law protected service animals, and if the HOA thought they could strong-arm him into getting rid of Max, they were in for a rude awakening. He turned the slip over, half expecting an official HOA stamp, but instead, there was only one name written at the bottom, in a signature that was as sharp and pointed as the note itself. Kara Martinez, HOA Community Standards Chair. As if summoned by the mere thought of her name, a voice cut through the air. You must be the new neighbor, the one breaking our rules. James looked up to see a woman marching toward him with the confidence of a dictator surveying her empire. Kara Martinez was the kind of person whose wealth didn't come from old money, but from clawing her way up through sheer, unrelenting entitlement. Perfectly styled hair, designer yoga outfit, the thin, pinch expression of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of disapproval. James, who had debated some of the most ruthless politicians in Congress, instinctively straightened his posture. "Nice to meet you," he said, extending a hand. "I'm James. This is Max, my service dog." Karen ignored his hand, her eyes fixed on Max, as if the mere sight of him offended her very existence. "We don't allow large dogs here," she said crisply. "They destroy property values." James tightened his grip on Max's leash, though his smile remained. "That's interesting," he said, pulling out his phone, "because federal law says otherwise." Karen's expression flickered, just for a moment, but she recovered quickly, snapping a picture of Max before James could react. "We'll see about that," she said, spinning on her heel and storming off. James exhaled slowly, glancing down at Max, who looked up at him with those knowing eyes. "Something tells me that won't be the last time we see her," he muttered. He had no idea just how right he was. The next morning, James stepped outside with a cup of coffee in one hand and Max's leash in the other, only to stop dead in his tracks. His fence, once a clean white, was now defaced with a single word, sprayed in bright red paint: violation. James let out a slow breath, his grip tightening around the mug. A deliberate act, a message. He walked up to the fence and touched the paint. Still wet. Max let out a low growl, his ears twitching as James looked toward the security cameras mounted on the corners of his house. He pulled out his phone, accessed the footage, and there it was, Kara Martinez, standing at the curb, directing someone as they sprayed graffiti in the early hours of the morning. James shook his head, a slow smile creeping onto his face. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He sent the footage to his personal legal team, drafted an email to the HOA board, and, just for good measure, printed a copy of the Fair Housing Act. He had spent years crafting legislation, fighting bureaucratic red tape. If Karen wanted a war, he would give her one. That evening, as he walked Max down the sidewalk, he saw neighbors peeking through their curtains. Some nodded sympathetically. Others looked away. A battle was brewing, and James was ready. If the vandalism had been Karen's opening shot, what came next was an all-out offensive. First, it was the false complaints. Allegations that Max was barking at all hours of the night, despite video evidence proving otherwise. Then came the fabricated waste problem. One morning, James woke up to find neatly placed piles of dog feces across his lawn. The placement was almost comical, too methodical, too perfect. James checked the security footage. Sure enough, there was Karen's teenage son, Tommy, awkwardly dropping the evidence onto his lawn while nervously glancing around. The poor kid. James almost felt bad for him. Almost. By the afternoon, printed flyers had been stuffed into every resident's mailbox. Dangerous animal in the neighborhood. The flyer included a grainy, zoomed-in photo of Max Midyon, his teeth bared as if in a snarl. James clenched his jaw. This wasn't just pettiness. This was a deliberate, calculated attempt to force him out. And if Karen thought he was going to roll over and accept it, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. It was time to strike back. James compiled a dossier, a thick file filled with security footage, copies of HOA letters, timestamps, and documentation. He had built political cases with less evidence. Then he made his move. At the next HOA meeting, James walked in, cool and collected. Every seat was filled. The air buzzed with murmurs. Karen sat at the front, her usual smug expression firmly in place. James took his time, setting down a stack of papers before looking up at her. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice calm but commanding. I'd like to address the ongoing harassment against my federally protected service animal. The room fell silent. With a slow smile, James pulled up his phone, tapped the screen, and let the security footage play for everyone to see. Karen's face turned a shade of purple James had never seen before. By the way, he said smoothly, does the HOA carry insurance for violating federal housing laws? Silence. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. James leaned back, folded his arms, and let the weight of the moment settle. They had underestimated him. Now they would pay the price. James had always found peace in tending to his garden. It was a simple pleasure, digging his hands into the soil, watching the tomato vines twist and curl, feeling the sun warm his back as Max lay lazily beside him. Gardening had become part of his therapy, a way to stay grounded. So, when he stepped outside one morning and found his garden dying, the rage hit him like a punch to the gut. The leaves on his tomato plants, once vibrant and green, had turned a sickly yellow. The rosemary bush he'd been carefully cultivating was nothing more than a withered husk. His cucumber vines gone. Even the community food bank plot he'd been nurturing had been reduced to brittle stems. Max whined, sniffing at the soil before jerking back, his nose wrinkling in disgust. James crouched, ran his fingers through the dirt, and brought them to his nose. A bitter, acrid scent burned his nostrils. Weed killer, industrial strength. He didn't need to check the security footage to know who had done it, but he checked anyway. And there it was, Karen's husband, Mike, creeping into his yard under cover of night, dressed in a black hoodie like some cartoon villain. He carried a sprayer, moving in swift, deliberate motions, coating every inch of the garden with poison. James exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the edge of the table as he rewatched the footage. This wasn't just a petty HOA dispute anymore. This was war. He sent the footage to his lawyer, drafted yet another police report, and added it to his growing stack of evidence. But this time he did something else. He called his friend at the local news station. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, then so be it. James arrived at the next HOA meeting armed with facts, footage, and the full force of the law. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a place usually reserved for potlucks and holiday gatherings. But tonight, the atmosphere was charged, tense. Karen sat at the front, her hands folded primly in her lap, a smug expression plastered across her face. Beside her, Barbara Thompson, the HOA president, flipped through a thick folder of complaints, barely sparing James a glance. James walked to the center of the room, Max at his side. The room fell silent. Barbara cleared her throat. "We have several urgent matters to discuss tonight regarding—" "If I may," James interrupted smoothly, his voice cutting to the air like a blade. Barbara's eyes narrowed. "This meeting is for HOA members only." "I am an HOA member," James said, a slow smile forming. "And as a homeowner, I have some concerns of my own." He reached into his bag, pulled out a flash drive, and held it up. "Let's talk about garden poisoning, vandalism, and illegal harassment." Barbara's mouth opened, then closed. Karen's face drained of color. James plugged the drive into the projector. The screen flickered to life. And then, in full high-definition clarity, the room watched as Karen's husband trespassed onto James' property, dousing his garden in poison. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Barbara's hands twitched over her folder. This is out of context." "Is it?" James arched an eyebrow. "Would you like to explain it then? Or should I call Officer Martinez and let her explain the federal penalties for property damage and targeted harassment?" Karen shot to her feet. "This is ridiculous," she screeched. "That dog is a nuisance. This whole thing is about property values. Is that why your unauthorized pool installation caused the only actual property value decrease in the last year?" James countered, flipping open his own folder. Karen's face went purple. Barbara cleared her throat, her grip tightening on the chair's armrests. "I think we should adjourn this discussion until—" "Until what?" James pressed. "Until the news picks up the story? Because I sent them everything. The security footage, the vandalism, even your discriminatory HOA complaints." The silence that followed was deafening. And James knew, in that moment, he had won this round. The real nightmare came the next morning. James was out in the backyard, sipping coffee while Max did his morning exercises. The air was crisp, the kind of morning that felt like a fresh start. Then he heard Karen's voice. "You're filming this, right, Tom?" James turned. Karen stood at her back fence, phone in hand, recording him. Beside her, her husband, Tom Martinez, a man with no real authority but a dangerously inflated sense of power, stepped forward. And James saw the gun. His pulse kicked up. Max, ever alert, shifted to stand between James and the fence, his body going rigid. "Tom," James said slowly, carefully, "put the gun down." Tom's grip tightened. "You've been a nuisance since you moved in." Tom snapped. "This isn't your kind of neighborhood." Karen nodded eagerly, filming the whole thing. James' blood ran cold. Then, in the distance, a car backfired. Karen screamed. Tom flinched. His finger twitched. The shot rang out. The sound cracked through the morning air like a bolt of thunder. Max yelped, and James watched in horror as his best friend collapsed to the ground, blood staining the freshly cut grass. Karen gasped. "Self-defense," she screeched. "You all saw it. The dog was attacking." But when James looked up, he saw neighbors holding their phones, recording every second of the truth. And Tom Martinez? His gun tumbled from his hands, the color draining from his face as he realized what he had done. James dropped to his knees, cradling Max's head as his heartbeat pounded in his ears. Sirens wailed in the distance. But James didn't care, because all that mattered now was Max. James sat in the emergency vet's waiting room, Max's blood still staining his hands. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. "Sir," came the voice of his chief of staff on the other end of the line, urgent and breathless. "You need to check the news." James clicked on the first link she sent. The video was everywhere. Grainy footage taken from multiple angles, showing the entire incident. Karen screaming about property values. Tom pulling the trigger. Max collapsing. It had already amassed over 1 million views. Justice for Max was trending nationwide. And James? James had had enough. When Karen and Barbara burst into the emergency vet's office, their faces pale with fear, James simply looked up. You're him," Barbara stammered, gripping her phone. "You're Congressman Sullivan." James stood, towering over them, his voice low and deadly calm. "And you," he said, are about to learn exactly what happens when you mess with a congressman's service dog. Karen took a step back, because now they knew who they were really dealing with, and they were terrified. James had spent years untangling bureaucratic corruption, exposing fraudulent housing policies, and fighting for fairness in homeownership. But never in his wildest imagination had he expected to expose a criminal empire in his own neighborhood. Yet, as he sat at his desk, scrolling through the mountain of evidence his team had compiled, it was clear. Oak Estates wasn't just a bad HOA. It was a machine built on fear, intimidation, and illegal activity. Emails, financial records, and recorded conversations painted a damning picture. Karen and Barbara had been systematically targeting minorities, single mothers, elderly residents, and disabled homeowners with excessive fines and fabricated violations. HOA funds, collected under guise of community improvements, had been funneled directly into Barbara's personal accounts, paying for extravagant vacations and luxury renovations. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about his fight anymore. It was about every single person this HOA had ever bullied into silence. So he made the call. Special Agent Thompson, he said when the line connected, "I have something you might want to see." The police arrived at the Martinez household early the next morning. James stood on his front porch, Max resting at his feet, watching as the scene unfolded. Karen burst out the front door, her hair disheveled, her voice shrill. "You don't understand. We're the victims. He set us up." Officer Martinez, who, James noted with some satisfaction, had always hated Karen, folded her arms. "We have video footage, ma'am," she said flatly. "Several, actually." Karen's mouth snapped shut. Behind her, Tom was being led away in handcuffs, his face pale, his hands trembling. Animal cruelty, reckless endangerment, and unlawful discharge of firearm. Officer Martinez listed off, not to mention civil lawsuits incoming. Tom turned, locking eyes with James. "You think this is over?" he snarled. James smiled coldly. "Oh, I know it's over," he said. And it was. Max had survived the gunshot, but the damage was done. The vet had told James that while Max would live, he'd never walk the same way again. The bullet had torn through muscle, leaving his once powerful stride uneven, his movements slower, more deliberate. The first time Max tried to stand, he collapsed. James felt his heart break all over again. But then Max tried again, and again, until, one shaky step at a time, he made his way across the room. James had seen courage in war. He had seen it in soldiers, in wounded veterans, in the eyes of those who had nothing left but determination. And now he saw it in Max. "You're a fighter," James whispered, running a hand through Max's golden fur. "We don't quit, buddy. Not now. Not ever." Max's tail wagged, and James knew somehow that they were going to be okay. The HOA scandal had gone national. James' phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls from Congress, media outlets, disability rights groups, and veteran advocacy organizations. The footage of the shooting, combined with the exposed corruption, had ignited a firestorm. And suddenly, a bill that had been quietly gathering dust in committee, the Homeowner Protection and HOA Oversight Act, was on a fast track to becoming law. James stood in front of Congress, Max by his side as he addressed the floor. For years, corrupt HOA boards have bullied, harassed, and exploited homeowners. "It stops now," he said, voice steady. "And let the case of Oak Estates serve as Exhibit A." Applause thundered through the chamber. And James knew Karen's worst nightmare had come true. She hadn't just lost. She had become a cautionary tale. The for sale sign went up in Karen's yard a few weeks later. James watched from his porch as she loaded boxes into her car, her expression tight and bitter. Her house, once one of the most expensive in the neighborhood, had been forced into a short sale. Nobody wanted to live in a home owned by the woman who shot a congressman's service dog. As she slammed her car door shut, her eyes flicked toward James. He raised his coffee mug in a mocking salute. Karen's face burned red, but she said nothing. She had already lost everything. But as her car pulled away, James' gaze fell to the envelope sitting on his desk, a certified letter from Karen's lawyer. His smile faded, because he knew this fight might not be over yet. And he was ready, because Max was worth every battle.